Hello friend, thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today let's spend some time with The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan, originally published back in 1992. This is book 4 of the Wheel of Time series that I have been reading my way through over the last few months. So I was actually going to delay reading this book, this fourth book, for a while, but my coworker, who is also buddy reading this series with me, started like planting it into my head, like, let's go ahead and do The Shadow Rising. Let's go ahead and read The Shadow Rising. So it didn't take much to talk me into going ahead and getting into book 4 because I have been enjoying this series so much. So yeah, it is in a series. I am going to be careful, though, in this chat to not give away any kind of spoilers or anything that I think would detract from a first-time reader's experience with this book. Now, I want to ask my viewers, though, if you think it would be fun to have like half the videos in the future for this series be as spoilers with spoilers. Maybe have the first half be just sort of my general take on the book, and then the last maybe half or so or less be that would contain some spoilers. So let me know down in the comments what you think about that format. But for this particular chat, I'm going to stick with the no spoilers format. Okay, let's get to it. So what is this one about? This book basically picks up where the last book left off, so for our main characters. Now, one thing about this book, though, that I noticed, especially reading this one, is that it doesn't take for granted that the reader has read the previous books. There is some explanation about the basics, the basic working of this fantasy world. This is fantasy. I didn't mention that earlier. So, there's a system of magic in this book, and then there's, a whole sort of world built, that's been built, fantasy world that's been built. So there's explanations, though, for this in this book early on for each of the different sort of parts, sort of main parts of this world, this fantasy world. So how I thought I would approach this chat is for what it's about, since I'm not going to be giving away any spoilers, I came up with some general kind of questions that I asked myself about this book. And one is, the first one is, who grows the most in this book? So of our main characters from the previous books, I think who grew the most in this book was Rand, and Perrin. Also Fail, his Perrin's girlfriend, I guess, at this point. Their characters really grow. And also the girls, Nynaeve, Egwene, and to some lesser degree, Elaine. Also experienced quite a bit of growth. Some of the characters that I felt were more in the background this time was Lan and Moraine, who had big parts in especially the first couple of books, have lesser parts here in this book. And then Matt, also I felt he's pretty significant throughout the book, but I felt like what he had to do in the book was less, as well as Tom, the Gleeman, also has, really less to do in this book than in previous books. We did, Matt's kind of I'm on the fence about, because there's quite a bit of Matt in this book, but I think not quite as much as there maybe was in the previous book. So things that get explained in more detail. So one thing that gets explained in more detail here, quite significantly, is the backstory of the breaking of the world. So in this fantasy world, there has been a breaking of the world in the past, which it disrupted the system of magic in this world. I've talked about this in my previous chats. By the way, I will link to those other chats down in the details down below if you are interested, if you haven't seen those or you're interested to see those. But the breaking of the world, in the previous books, we know kind of what all happened in the breaking of the world, but not some of the details. And that gets explained, really, I think, a lot more here. Also, I think it gets explained more here about the workings of the Dark Friends and the Forsaken. I talked about these in some of the previous chats as well. There's the Dark One, these forces of evil. There's a central force of evil called the Dark One, and then those who serve the Dark One. There's these Forsaken. The Forsaken were at one time very powerful Aes Sedai, people that can wield magic, both the male and the female form of magic. The Forsaken and the Dark Friends are those who serve. The Dark Friends are people who just, are sort of in everyday life, but nevertheless, they've sworn fealty to the Dark One, and they serve the interests of the Dark One and the Forsaken. And so, I think that the workings of that throughout all the world. So our characters in this book, they start out more or less in the same place. Min is at Tar Valon, the seat of the Aes Sedai, but the main characters are where they wound up in the end of the last book, in that city, and then they spread out. They go to different places, and then the action takes place both all the way back into Two Rivers, Emma's Field, where our characters originally came from, the Aiel Waste, others, Terabon, Tar Valon. So the characters sort of get spread out. But through this, we see the forces of change at work. And these forces of change are not good because they are being led by the Dark One. So I think that's explained quite a bit of detail. That's actually one of the main, I think, points of this book, was to take us through this part, the start of the sort of new age that's been about to come about due to the dragon being reborn. So, yeah. All right, so just some other main themes of interest that I took away from the book. I have this quote here: "The wheel weaves as the wheel wheels." That's a standard quote throughout this entire series. This wheel of time, sort of the wheel of fate, it weaves the pattern of fate as it wants to, and it draws people in and uses them for that purpose, sometimes to, against their will. And there's a quote here from Fael, who is talking to Perrin, her boyfriend, and, both of them really, Fael had come into this adventure in the previous book, I believe it was, and she was seeking adventure, which she definitely ended up finding. Perrin, has been in the story since the very first book, and he really just wanted to be a blacksmith. He was a blacksmith's apprentice, and he really wanted this simple life, but he got drawn into something far greater than that, basically against his will. But Fael says to him at one point, "Poor Perrin, I left Saldea to find adventure, and now that I'm in the heart of one, the greatest since the breaking, all I want is to go somewhere else. You just want to be a blacksmith, and you're going to end up in the stories whether you want it or not." Other characters in this story, like Rand and others, also find themselves in places in their lives that they did not expect at the very beginning in book one. They are being pulled along by the wheel of time to play their part in sort of a cosmic drama in this world. So I just think that is so cool and so fun. And one of the main things that makes this story so interesting to read. This is another kind of recurring theme, I think, in the book, is how young people, most of the main characters are these younger people. They're drawn into the wheel of time has drawn them in and weaving them into the pattern. Some of them very strongly. There's Taverns like Rand, Perrin, and Matt. Taverns are those who really, the weave of time, the weave of fate was very strongly being woven around, and they pull others sort of into their orbit. They're young, and so they don't have experience. They don't have a lot of world wisdom because they come from this provincial place. Many of our characters, they have specific talents to themselves or specific skills that they have, and there's no one that appears to be able to teach them. Now, there are some teachers that show up in front of them, and when those teachers show up in front of them, like, for example, Moraine, who is an Aes Sedai, they don't trust them. So often the youth young people don't necessarily trust the wisdom of their elders because they feel like their elders are trying to control them. In some cases, they are, actually. And so there's that tension that I thought was real cool. But okay, before I run out of time, the Way of the Leaf is talked about here a lot. It goes all the way back to the breaking of the world. I've mentioned this in some previous videos. The Way of the Leaf is a philosophy of non-violence, extreme pacifism. They do not do violence in any form, even when faced with violence themselves. they will be killed rather than do violence against another. And this philosophy was present, we learn, at the breaking of the world. We learn a lot of the backstory of the way of the leaf and that philosophy through time. And then we see it also in play in the present day of the book, where there is a conflict that involves some of the traveling people that still espouse this way of the leaf, and how they have to face against just the cruel violence of the Trollocs and the Dark One and his allies, and how they manage that in a non-violent way, or how they cope with that in a non-violent way. Just really interesting there. You know, we also saw the beginning of the White Cloaks. So at the beginning of institutions here, there's several cases where we see some, like, okay, that's going to become an institution. Around Perrin, for example, but the White Cloaks, in this backstory of the breaking of the world, we sort of get a glimpse of how they got started. The White Cloaks are sort of a religious extremist organization of purity, sort of like an inquisition. They're really kind of radical and feared among the general population. So that was also really fun. Finally, just the last idea that I'm going to throw out here is controlling others, you know, through things. So the Dark Friends, the Dark One, the Dark Friends, and the Forsaken, they appeal to people to become Dark Friends or to help the Dark Friends through things like fear and greed and, you know, hatefulness, suspicion, these sort of negative emotions. That's how they control people. And then, you know, the forces of good, the forces of light, you know, it's through love, it's through friendship, it's through loyalty, it's through devotion, it's through, you know, sort of the positive things are it's what motivates them, or what, you know, convinces people to go to their side. And so I think that's so sort of true in a general sense. It might sound simplistic, but ultimately, if you're getting led around making decisions based around fear, greed, or anything like that, suspicion, probably not the best decision. You're probably not making the best decisions. You know, if you're focusing that around some other emotions, you might wind up in a better place. I think that's a good life lesson there. All right, I will leave the chat here. You know, this book was flawed. It has its flaws, but nevertheless, I enjoyed it very much. It was a real page turner. I could barely put it down. So exciting. I just love this world, this fantasy world. Love the magic system that's built, this gendered magic. It's just so interesting to me. And I will be reading book 5. I'm going to try, my buddy reader and I, my coworker and I, we may try to wait a month or two before we read book 5, but we shall see when that will be coming up. But I'm going to try to get through, I think, the first 7 books this year, and so the next one is book 5. But nevertheless, the next chat is going to be, let me just call it up here. My next chat is going to be The High Window by Raymond Chandler. I have already finished this. This is some hard-boiled detective fiction from 1940s. Loved it. The High Window chat should be coming up soon. Until next time, take care.